and welcome into another edition of the Brian on Baseball podcast. Here we go now on this Thursday, February the 13th. The year is 2020. I'm Brian Goudsward, coming to you on another rainy day. It seems like we've had a string of them here lately in Middletown, New Jersey, but baseball in some capacity at least is on the field, with pitchers and catchers having reported or soon to be within the next couple of days, but locally they have reported. Many other teams have had their pitchers and catchers on the field, and it's always a time that brings optimism for all 30 ball clubs because every team is 0-0 at this point. And in Met Camp, for one, there is optimism abound, especially for this pitching staff. You have the staff leader, Jacob deGrom, already talking up a potential third consecutive Cy Young Award, something that only two other pitchers in the history of the game have accomplished, but those are the sights that deGrom has set on. For the Yankees, it's kind of business as usual as camp is about to begin, coming off a 100-plus win season when they had so many injuries to deal with and now have some big parts as part of this team to try to conquer an American League this season. I was thinking about this when it comes to the Yankees. They won over 100 games a year ago. Now they add Garrett Cole, a guy in Giancarlo Stanton who was an MVP a couple of years ago, barely played last year, and Miguel Andujar, who was second in the Rookie of the Year voting a couple years ago, barely played last season. So they won over 100 games, now add arguably the best pitcher in the game, a former MVP to an already formidable lineup, and Miguel Andujar, a doubles machine, a key bat in that lineup. I mean, the Yankees are going to be scary, and it already looks like it on paper, so look out from that standpoint. All right, later on in the show today, we are going to resume with our top five right now after a one-week hiatus. Today we'll give you our picks for the two positions on the left side of the infield, shortstop and third base. We'll have This Day in Baseball History, plus PECOTA has their projections. Yes, good old PECOTA with their win total projections for each of the teams. Today we'll have a sneak peek at what they have for the National League, a couple of surprises. We'll break down a couple things there. But we have to start with the big news coming just this morning, and that was after the Astros decided to meet the media outside their spring training complex in Palm Beach, Florida, where this was their opportunity, right, to face the music, so to speak, to face the nation and give us something, anything, about all the turmoil that is surrounding this franchise. Some semblance of an apology, talk about what happened, any details that they could provide. This was the chance for America to sit down and see what the prominent voices from the Astros, from ownership on down to the star players, had to say regarding the matter. And instead, what we got was absolutely nothing, because the organization decided to send out two of their star players, Alex Bregman and Jose Altuve. Now, this is a team that anybody who knows the game and watches baseball and knows about the Astros know that this team has a swagger. They are flowing with personality from Bregman on down. They love the microphone. They love the spotlight. They're oozing with personality. And what did we get this morning but these contrived, pre-prepared, monotone statements from both Bregman and Altuve that did nothing to satisfy anybody who was ready to listen, and in fact made themselves look even worse because there was just no gain from this whatsoever. If anything, it was a negative because they didn't do anything to make themselves look any better. And all you got from Bregman was, oh, we're sorry to our fans and blah, 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 and we're just ready to move forward. And combined, Bregman and Altuve spoke for total less than 90 seconds. I mean, how ridiculous is that? This was your chance to put the faces of your franchise in front of the media and have them talk for a few minutes and maybe take some questions. And I know they did end up taking questions in the locker room afterwards, but that's too little too late. This was their chance to say something, and they failed to the highest order. And they are getting beaten up from the media left and right to every talk show in America, and they deserve it because they're involved here in one of the biggest scandals in the history of the game. Some people think this is number one, even above the steroid era. and they have nothing to say about it. They got prominent people fired. They face no discipline whatsoever. That was the decision by the report and Rob Manfred. But you got your prominent manager, A.J. Hinch, fired. Your general manager, Jeff Luhnow, fired. You would think there would be, and maybe there was some remorse, and I think a couple of players did come across a little bit more candid when speaking to reporters, like especially Carlos Correa and George Springer. But with Bregman and Altuve, there was just nothing. Absolutely nothing gained. It was just stale. There was nothing to it. There was no pizzazz. It was monotone. And it was frankly unacceptable, and I think the organization should be ashamed of itself. Then you have the owner, Jim Crane, get up there and act like he doesn't even know that the sign stealing helped the ball club that much. Well, if that was the case, why did this go on? Why did it go on into the playoffs for multiple years? Now, there's some reports that this went on even before the 2017 season. A Washington Post article said this started in 2016, so we don't exactly know when it started. But the bottom line is this has been going on now for years for a team that was winning in the hundreds of games that won a World Series. And I just think their actions today were disgraceful. They did nothing to shed light on the situation. This was their one opportunity. Yeah, they've been asked here and there since it came out last month and the suspensions and punishments were handed down, and you got the same bogus answers then. But this was really the opportunity to sit in front of a podium, in front of the media, in front of all baseball fans that cared as to what they had to say this morning, and you got pre-prepared statements that were just nonsense, that didn't come across as sincere. It just was a bad look all in all. I don't think anybody could have liked, whether you're an Astro fan, whether you're a neutral baseball fan, this just did not do the trick, not by any stretch of the imagination. And in fact, I think they made themselves look worse, if that was even possible. This was nothing short of a disaster. And then you have the issue come up about the wearable devices, the buzzers, so to speak, that had been speculated, mainly because of the footage after Altuve's home run against Chapman in the ALCS last year against the Yankees, when he clearly was signaling for teammates not to rip off his jersey, that there was a lot of speculation he was wearing something underneath the jersey. And both A.J. Hinch, in his interview after he was fired with MLB Network's Tom Verducci, and Altuve just referred to the investigation, saying that didn't find anything of the like. Well, if you know this wasn't true, wouldn't you just come out and say a definitive no, we under no circumstances have ever worn any buzzers under the uniform? Instead, they have to refer to the investigation. That makes it look awfully sketchy and just adds to the speculation. That's why guys like Aaron Boone, when they're asked about this, and other players, the speculation is only growing that this was part of it and making it look even worse. So any way you slice it, it's just a disastrous situation for the Astros, one that Dusty Baker now inherits as the new manager. And go figure, Dusty actually got up there and came across the most sincere in his words. Now, I get it, he wasn't a part of this thing, but he's the kind of calming influence. This is why that was the right guy to hire, and why the Astros, if they made any right decision this offseason, was to bring in Dusty Baker as manager. And one of the reasons you saw why today, with how he handles himself in front of the media. But I look at this team going into the season now, and I have major questions. I don't think they just pick up right where they left off and become a 100-plus win team. And I'm kind of surprised there aren't more people who are of that belief. It seems like most people think the team is just so talented, they're going to win 100 games, they're going to cruise to another division title. No, this team is going to have a target on their back all season. There's going to be, I think, some brawls to come this season because of how many unhappy people there are in the game about this. They're going to get hit by a lot of pitches. They are going to, let's put it this way, no team is going to want to beat the Astros this season any more than an individual matchup in any other season. They are going to be the target of every team's schedule, and I just don't think it's going to be that easy, even with how talented they are. Plus, I don't think you can deny the sign stealing helped them. Maybe these players aren't quite as good as they appear. Maybe Bregman looks a little better than he is, and Altuve does, and Springer does. We'll see. This is their chance to prove everyone wrong, that, yeah, if they win the World Series, okay, that's something of a vindication. But otherwise, you have to say this played an enormous role, and you have to question just how good this team is, and I peg them down majorly in this American League in their own division. I still have them as a winning team, absolutely, but I think they're closer to the 90-win mark than they are to 100, 105 wins, like we've seen them run off easily in recent years. But boy, is it going to be interesting when their season begins. I think they have the Angels to start. And again, today was their chance to say something about the issue, to shed some light, to give some details. And instead, we got absolutely nothing. It was an unacceptable job all the way around. I, like many, down on the Astros for obvious reasons at this point in time. And now moving on to the next segment, because we had another big story within this past week, and it came courtesy of the New York Post, and that involves a proposed playoff expansion for Major League Baseball that would be set to begin potentially in the 2022 season. This came from Joel Sherman of the Post. I'll give you the breakdown of what the proposal has and then some thoughts on it, and obviously has received a lot of negative attention thus far. But the idea is that there would be 2 additional playoff teams in each of the National League and American League, in effect adding extra wildcard games. The wildcard games would, instead of a 1-game scenario, be a best-of-3 series that would all be played in the same ballpark. So it cuts down on travel and gives the home team the advantage as they play on their home field for all 3 of the games. And then comes the most interesting part of it, that the top team in each league would receive a first-round bye. They'd be on to the division series, would not participate in the wild card round. And then the best team in each league actually would pick their opponent, would do so on a TV broadcast that would take place on the last day of the regular season. A lot of intrigue to this. It's very interesting. There's been a lot of opinions, a lot of them negative to start out. But isn't that always the case with things like this? Nobody ever likes anything new, and especially in this age of social media and Twitter, people don't even take the time to process exactly what it means. They read something that's going to change. They're used to how things are in the game, and immediately the reaction is, oh no, this is no good. This is the worst idea in the history of baseball. Please don't do this. Keep everything the way it was. And that's what we've seen from fans to even players. Trevor Bauer, who we know is not shy and very outspoken about issues with the game, and he right away is attacking Rob Manfred, calling him a joke, among other things. But for me, this is interesting, and there are some aspects that have to get ironed out, and there's no playoff system that's going to be completely flawless. And like I said, there's going to be details that have to be worked out. But overall, I would have to say I like this idea. I like the idea of the TV show. Why? Because this gets more attention on the game, and I think that was the game's chief goal with this, is they understand attendance has been down now for the last 7 years, and it's been a major struggle to get the young person interested in baseball. And the hope is that doing something like this, doing something innovative involving the television component, would get more eyeballs, would get more attention. And I think that would prove successful. This is where it's at right now, getting deals with television, adding more teams. That's only where this is going. We're only adding more playoff teams. We're not subtracting. And one thing that I like about it is, you're a fan of a team, you have a better chance now of getting in the playoffs. Guess what? Last year, the Mets at 86 wins, on the outside looking in, would have been in the postseason. And you could say, well, that kind of drowns out the regular season, but it adds more competition, which is another one of the game's big concerns right now. All the rebuilding teams, suddenly there is more incentive to win, that if you enter a season and you're kind of in that 80 win range on paper, that maybe you make that extra move knowing that if you get to 85 wins, you're potentially in the big dance. And I just like this on a lot of levels. I like the idea of the TV show. I think that's going to get people interested. And anytime you have more games, there's more interest. It's kind of gotten comparisons to the NCAA tournament, where you have games scattered starting early in the afternoon. You start one at 1, and then 1:15, and then 2, all the way throughout the day. You could do something similar with baseball, and the baseball fan having a menu like that for the playoffs, sign me up. I think this is a win for baseball. I hope it happens. I know there's going to have to be some things that get ironed out, but I think people need to take a closer look at this and realize all the benefits that this has, and I think outweigh the negatives. And then you'll realize this would be good for the game, good to grow the game, get some more attention on the game, and overall be a positive all the way around for baseball, and again, set to begin, if all goes well, following the 2022 regular season. And now moving on to something that was addressed on last week's show, and that involves the three-team palooza, of course, involving Mookie Betts and David Price and prospects and that whole big shebang with Betts and company going to the Dodgers. And I bring it up again this week because we have a couple of changes. As I talked last week, the trade was still pending because of some medical concerns, mainly with the, at the time, Twins pitching prospect Brusdar Graterol, and the Red Sox were concerned about his medicals, and then there was some thought, well, maybe the trade would fall together completely, but they did get the details sorted out, made some changes. Instead, the Red Sox got a couple extra prospects. They got Jeter Downs, a highly regarded prospect within the Dodgers system, as well as another minor league catcher. Brusdar Graterol instead goes from the Twins to the Dodgers. There was originally some thought that the Twins would back out of the trade altogether. They wind up staying and deal Graterol to the Dodgers and still get Kenta Maeda to fill out their rotation. So not much to add other than that. We talked about it last week, about the Red Sox situation and all the heat that they're taking for dealing a player the status of Betts, and obviously how much of a win it is for the Dodgers, a team that won 106 games and now adds a player that's been worth anywhere between 6 and 10 wins himself over the last few years. So the Dodgers loaded on paper, and I like the addition of Price adding to that rotation. So any way you slice it, the Dodgers are just ready to dominate the National League. There's no other way to say it, while the Red Sox more in transition mode, seeing if they can remain competitive, still have a lot of talented players, but some things to work out and have to hope for good health from their starting rotation. But the end of an era in Boston anytime you let a player the caliber of Betts go, and obviously how much it has impacted the fan base and the negative feelings that have been directed toward Chaim Bloom, the chief baseball officer, and Red Sox ownership for being frugal and wanting to get under the luxury tax and all the ramifications that come with that. Then the other interesting thing is, as I talked about last week also, I was talking up the Angels after they acquired both Jock Peterson and Ross Stripling in what was a separate deal with the Dodgers. Well, that trade got nixed altogether. So whatever I said about the Angels last week regarding that trade, disregard, because Jock Peterson is not in their plans. Neither is Ross Stripling. I thought it would have been a big gain for the Angels, but it got nixed by the ownership, Artie Moreno. So Peterson and Stripling for now remain in Los Angeles. Peterson as part of a very crowded and talented outfield where playing time is going to be tough to come by, with Betts full-time in right and Bellinger full-time in center field, two guys that have won the MVP. You still got A.J. Pollock sitting there. You have Chris Taylor. So there's so many guys, but Peterson nonetheless a very productive player a year ago with 36 home runs. Whether he's a Dodger or elsewhere, he'll play a key role for someone in 2020. As far as some other latest signings going down within the last week or so, it seems like we've always had a host of kind of under-the-radar minor league one-year signings, and I'll run through those of the most significant, starting with the aforementioned Red Sox, and you figured they were going to do something following Betts' departure to Los Angeles, and they do make a signing with an outfielder, and one that I think will be a nice signing, getting Kevin Pillar off a nice year with the Giants, a one-year deal for the former Toronto Blue Jay, who finds his way back to the American League East. And he's always had a great reputation as a defensive center fielder. Coming off a solid offensive season, he's no Mookie Betts, and nobody's going to fool you into thinking that. But I think he's going to play a key role for the Red Sox. I like this signing. I think he's going to play a lot for Boston this season. Then another outfielder that kind of fits a similar mold is the former Met Juan Lagares. He has a new home now across the country in San Diego. Padres recently dealt a defensive first outfielder, Manuel Margot, as part of a deal with the Tampa Bay Rays. They landed a stud reliever, Emilio Pagan, but they get Lagares to fill the void left by Margot, another guy that, as we know here in the New York metro area, is an outstanding fielder, leaves a lot to be desired with the bat, but he nonetheless now a member of the Padres. Sticking in the National League West, where the Arizona Diamondbacks recently announced a 4-year extension with their shortstop Nick Ahmed, slick fielder, 4 years and $32.5 million for the Yukon product. And then over to Pittsburgh, who, as we know, recently traded Starling Marte to Arizona, so they now have a void in center field, and they try to fill that by inking the former Diamondback and World Series winner with the Kansas City Royals, Gerard Dyson. And then finally to Detroit, who signs Cameron Maybin, which is interesting because if you remember way back now when Maybin was actually drafted by the Tigers, started his career there, and then was part of that monster Miguel Cabrera, Dontrelle Willis deal, went on to the, at that time, Florida Marlins, eventually got a pretty sizable contract with the Padres that he didn't live up to, became kind of a journeyman player bouncing all around. Well, last year, if you remember, with the Yankees, he was one of the guys who fit the bill as filling in for injured players and producing. That's exactly what he did a year ago in the Bronx. Gets himself another year with a major league contract, back where it all started for the veteran Maybin to Detroit. The Red Sox, meanwhile, have officially and finally announced that Ron Roenicke is going to be their interim manager. The interim tag mainly because the investigation is still ongoing with the Red Sox regarding the 2018 season in regards to their own sign-stealing controversy, and the thought is, should something come out about Roenicke being involved in that they would remove him from that position and then undergo another process where they would add a manager. But I think reasonably confident he was not a part of that, and thus naming him as the interim manager for the 2020 season, the former manager of the Milwaukee Brewers. And finally, on the newswire, Major League Baseball announcing their rule changes to go into effect for this season, and that includes the 3-batter minimum for all relievers, with the exception of if it's ending an inning, all relievers will have to face a minimum of 3 hitters, and also the rosters expanding from 25 to 26 until September. And then the one other change is that managers in the dugout will now have 20 seconds instead of 30 to decide whether they are going to challenge a call on the field. And with that, we are going to transition into the top 5 right now. Our response, of course, to the top 10 right now show on MLB Network, hosted by Brian Kenny. Last week, we forgot our notes, so we took a 1-week break, but we're back at it here on this Thursday with picks at shortstop and third base. So as we do each week, we go through what the Shredder had for its top 5 selections, and I counter with my response. And here are the Shredder's picks at shortstop. They had the Rockies' Trevor Story taking the top spot, Francisco Lindor right behind him, Javi Baez 3, Marcus Semien off a breakout season at number 4, with Xander Bogaerts at 5. And I make a couple of amendments here. I flip-flopped the top 2 choices by the Shredder and went with Francisco Lindor, number 1. We know he's been the subject of a lot of trade rumors this offseason, but just such a talented player, switch hitter. It's funny that when he came up, you thought he was going to be a guy that would be a great fielder, but that the bat would take some time, that he wouldn't have as big of an impact with the bat. Well, it turns out he has just as big, if not bigger, as a hitter, with the fact that he can hit over 30 home runs. Nothing he can't do. He's fun to watch. He plays with a smile on his face. Multiple-time All-Star, Gold Glove winner. Nothing you can't like about Francisco Lindor. And the big question is, how much longer is he a Cleveland Indian? And then Trevor Story, I go with number 2, a guy who has risen to the ranks of being one of the elite players in the game because of what he does both sides, offense, defense, such a strong throwing arm. You thought it would take a while before the Rockies found a good replacement for Troy Tulowitzki, who of course played that position so terrifically with the Rockies for many years, albeit oft injured. Well, they found their replacement fairly quick, with Story emerging, remember, right off the bat, all the home runs he hit in the month of April, and he's taken off now and become one of the elite players in the game. Now, at number 3, I go with someone who wasn't even on the Shredder's list for top 5, and I saw enough of Fernando Tatis Jr. in only 80-something games that he played last season to feel that he belongs in the top 5 and even in the top 3. I mean, this guy was so exceptional what he was able to do. Skills were off the charts, and it's things that you don't see from the common players. It's instincts, it's base running. There's some of the highlights we saw scoring on a pop-up to shallow center field that the shortstop caught, turned it into a sacrifice fly. I mean, he's just an electrifying talent, a guy that the Padres just stole. All they gave up was James Shields for him. Shields, who was washed up at the time. Tatis was an unknown commodity within the White Sox organization and has blossomed into already a star. And I've seen enough. I think this guy is going to be a superstar player for years to come. And in such a limited sample size, what he did offensively, defensively, base running, you just have to love everything about him. And I think I'm generally a guy who wants to see a pretty good sampling, but I was just sold what this guy did in only 80 games. My number 3 shortstop goes to the San Diego Padre. And I'll put Xander Bogaerts at the number 4 spot, who's become such a prolific offensive player, probably his best season a year ago. The defensive metrics don't love him, but look, he's as solid as they come and very deserving to be in the top 5 and will now carry a bigger weight on his shoulders, so to speak, especially offensively, with Betts departing to the Dodgers. And I round out my top 5 with Javi Baez, another guy who's just electrifying, so fun to watch. When he came up, there was so much swing and miss to his game. You wondered, would he be able to stick as a major leaguer? Well, he answered that bell. He played multiple positions until he's found his permanent home at shortstop. He's got power. He plays with a swagger. Javi Baez of the Cubs, a guy who they're likely to lock up long term, and some of the reason why they're looking to move some of their other parts, potentially a Chris Bryant. Whether that happens before the season remains to be seen, but Baez, I think they are going to commit to, and why not, with a guy of his skills. So my shortstops go Lindor, Story, Tatis Jr., Bogaerts, and Baez. Now we'll move over to third base, where the Shredders list goes as this. They go with Alex Bregman in the top spot, Anthony Rendon, Nolan Arenado, a clear top 3 there, with Matt Chapman at number 4, and Jeff McNeil, how about that, making his debut on the top 10 list and all the way up at number 5 after a fine first full season in Queens. And I make some changes there. I don't put McNeil in the top 5. This is a loaded position, and there's a lot of star quality to it, and I'd probably had McNeil in my top 10, but top 5 is a little bit of a stretch. I start with Nolan Arenado, who I think the audience knows I've talked about a lot this offseason, as to me, he is the best player at the position. And does he get a boost with Coors Field? Maybe the numbers inflated just a little bit, but you know what? The guy puts up 40 home runs, 120 RBIs year in and year out, and he's like the best defensive third baseman that I've ever seen. Some of the opinion he's the best since Brooks Robinson from years ago, that he and Matt Chapman are the best defensive third baseman since Robinson. And when you have a guy who's just that good on both sides, he has to be number 1 for me. And again, he's been the subject of trade rumors because the Rockies are kind of a mess. Their front office doesn't know what it's doing. They were shopping around Arenado, then the GM comes out and says we're keeping him, so they don't know what they're doing. But the bottom line is that relationship has been strained. But I'll tell you this, whoever gets Nolan Arenado is going to be awfully happy that they got him, because that's how good he is, and he's my number 1 third baseman. I'll go with Rendon number 2, who, as we know, is playing with a new team in the Angels in 2020, but off his best season with Washington, culminating in a World Series championship. It took time for him to reach elite status, but he has arrived now as a former first-round pick. It's all come together offensively, defensively for Rendon. Is one of the game's best and my number 2 first baseman. And you could very easily make the argument number 1. Now, you could make the argument also that Alex Bregman is number 1. And when I did this list originally, I think I probably would have had Bregman 1, but for obvious reasons, I've knocked down the Astros a couple of pegs, and you heard when I did second base, I knocked Altuve down. I'm doing the same with Bregman. Look, he's a great player, but was he enhanced by the sign stealing? I think there's certainly a case to be made by that, so I'm putting him in the number 3 spot. And then I'll go with Matt Chapman at number 4 is another guy that is just so good on the defensive side. Offensively, he's been a little bit up and down, but I think you're going to see more consistency to come for this Oakland A guy who is a cornerstone player with Matt Olson. They got 2 of them on each end of the infield. And Chapman, I think there's MVPs in his future. I think he's going to be one of the elite players in the game. He's got 30 to 35 home run power, potentially more. I think he'll hit for a better average than he did a year ago. And defensively, there's no warts in his game. So he's at number 4. And then I do something different for number 5 and go with Chris Bryant. And I know he hasn't quite been there the last couple of years, mainly because he's been limited by injuries. But I think if this guy is healthy for a full season, you're going to see a big year. And look, we've already seen what he's capable of. At unanimous or close to unanimous MVP, was Rookie of the Year, and he's battled a lot of injuries the last couple of years that I think have kind of hindered his game. But when he's right, he's an on-base machine. You'll see the on-base percentage approach 400. Power, which has been lacking, I still think he can hit 30 to 35 home runs. Good enough at third base. He's still, to me, is a star player, and I don't think we've seen the best yet from Chris Bryant. I think we're going to see him start to return to that MVP form, and it might come as soon as this season. Whether it's with the Chicago Cubs or not, well, that remains a question. A lot of these guys on the trading block, I named a lot of star players, but Lindor, Arenado, Bryant, all have in common, they're all being shopped around by their teams, and whoever gets any of them is going to be very happy that they did. So to round out third base, I go with Nolan Arenado, Anthony Rendon, Alex Bregman. That's the consensus top 3, with the A's Matt Chapman and Chris Bryant of the Cubs rounding out the list. And with that, we will jump into this day in baseball history and recent baseball history on the occasion of today's. It was back on this day, February the 13th, 2008, in a much-anticipated congressional hearing. Roger Clemens and his former personal trader Brian McNamee testified for 4.5 hours concerning the allegations of the Rockets' use of performance-enhancing drugs. Republicans appear to believe the 7-time Cy Young Award winner, while Democrats seem to favor his chief accuser's account of events. And time now for the 9th inning, the segment where we close out the show. And for the segment today, we're going to take a look at what PECOTA, which seems to be baseball gospel these days as they come out with all their advanced projections for players and teams for the upcoming season. And they came out with their projected records for all 30 teams. Today we'll focus on the National League. Next week, perhaps, we'll do the American League. And I'll highlight a couple of interesting tidbits. For the National League East, for one, they have the Mets winning this division at 88 wins, which I talked about last week. The Mets could win the division, they could finish 4th, anywhere in between, and I wouldn't be surprised. That's just how the Mets are. They're unpredictable, they're talented enough, but there's always questions, there's always doom that potentially looms, whether it's injury-related or otherwise, so you just never know exactly what to expect from the Mets. But from PECOTA's estimation, the Mets are going to win the division. We'll see. The one thing that's curious here, though, is they have the Braves 4th place at 83 wins. And I just don't know what I'm missing here for a team that won in the upper 90s, has been in the playoffs now the last couple of years. I get it. They lost Josh Donaldson. That's a big bet to lose, but they added Marcell Ozuna. I know that's somewhat of a drop-off from Donaldson, but this team, all in all, is pretty solid, and pitching-wise has a lot of young guns, from Soroka to Max Fried. You got another year in the maturation process of Ronald Acuna, a superstar in the game, Freddie Freeman, Ozzie Albies. I mean, to me, this is a team that at the minimum should be in the low 90s. I'm just not quite sure what PECOTA sees when taking a look at the Braves. In the National League Central, they are high on the Reds, and why not after what has been a busy offseason, adding Mike Moustakas, Nicholas Castellanos, the Japanese import Akiyama. This team looks pretty good on paper. They look improved. They already had a good pitching staff, and it's a division that is up for the taking. So they have the Reds at the top spot, still higher than most on the Cubs, projecting them at 85 wins, and I think that is the right call, just because there still is a lot of talent on that roster. Down more on the Cardinals, who they have as an under 500 team, and it's been a very quiet, noticeably quiet offseason for the Cardinals, who I'm a little bit down on too. I'm not sure I would go as low as that, though, as this is a team that always seems to figure it out and never manages a losing season. So interesting there. And then out west, it's pretty much as cut and dry as this. The Dodgers, they projected over 100, 103 now with Betts in the fold, among others, and nobody else in the division do they even project as a winning ball club. Says a lot about the state of the division, although there were a lot of high reviews on what the Diamondbacks did this offseason with Madison Bumgarner, and they're a team that generally seems to figure it out with Torey Lovello running the show there. I think there's going to be another team in this division that winds up over 500. I'm not sure it's going to be the Padres, who I still think are a couple of years away. The Rockies, who knows what to make of them. They're kind of in flux right now. So it is interesting, and all those teams have to face the Dodgers, and you figure the record isn't going to be very good in those individual matchups. So those are kind of a couple of things I found interesting about Pacoda's projections on the National League side, and we'll have some thoughts on the American League on our show next week. And one final note before we bid you adieu today. On a personal note, I have accepted a job to work for Sirius XM Radio, where I will be a play-by-play board op as the station takes in any number of different broadcasts from all different sports, baseball among them, but there'll be basketball, college basketball, maybe even tennis and golf, and I'll be kind of regulating the audio levels, tracking highlights, things of that nature. Very excited to get started. Should be within the next couple of weeks. And I'm looking forward to what the next opportunity presents itself in my career after spending the last 3 baseball seasons at MLB Network, where I was extremely fortunate to have the opportunity to work. As you know, listening to this podcast, baseball, my number one passion, and I loved watching the network before I started working. I still do. I will continue to, and working there was really an honor for me, and I enjoyed being there for parts of the last 3 years. So that will close this edition of the Brian on Baseball podcast. Thank you for listening today. Had so much to get to, from the Astros to the proposed expansion in baseball to all the latest news and signings and plenty more. We'll have another show for you next week as we inch closer to the start of spring training. Games on the field, both in Florida and Arizona. We'll have you covered as we get closer eventually to opening day, about a month and a half away, when every team will be on the field to start their season on March the 26th. So thank you again. Our thanks as always to Dylan DePrato. I'm Brian Goudsward. We'll see you again next week. Have a good one.